we've got to fundamentally reform and overhaul our universal credit system. I mean, not only has it been cut, people lost £20 a week, then there were a set of real terms cut, the value of it, because of inflation. Now there's this potential further real terms cut because of inflation again, and people are in absolute poverty and destitution. There's 500,000 children in this country who are destitute. The definition of destitution is that they can't heat their homes, or they're in cold homes, they're hungry, they can't afford basic toiletries to keep themselves clean, or they don't even have a bed to sleep in, probably sleeping on the kitchen floor or a bathroom floor or in a bath or on a living room floor. 500,000 children destitute, 4 million children in poverty. A food bank in my constituency, it opens its doors at 12 o'clock on a Friday. People will be queuing in all weather from about 9:30, 10 o'clock, all the way up the street for that food bank. And there are women who have gone to that food bank who have been offered fresh food, but have to turn down fresh food because the woman said, I can't afford to keep my fridge switched on. So they cannot afford the electricity bills associated with running a fridge to keep food fresh. We've got stories of children turning up at school with tummy bugs because the food has not been kept fresh in the fridge because families can't afford to keep their fridges on. We've got pensioners, as long as a pensioner who's undergoing rounds of chemotherapy but cannot heat her home because of energy bills. So we've got to change our universal credit system, and we've got to give people their dignity back.
Jonathan Ashworth, hello, how's it going?
Yeah, nice to see you.
Likewise. First of all, your reaction to PMQs there, please.
Oh, just terrible. I think, people across the country are absolutely terrified. They're looking at mortgages going up by hundreds of pounds a month. We've got people who are struggling to feed their children, queuing up at food banks, and Liz Truss's response to all these serious questions are just abysmal. The Conservative government, not only have they made things so much worse, they've created this disaster, a disaster made in Downing Street, if you like. They've clearly got no answers for the real concerns and worries of the British people.
How long do you reckon Truss has got?
I don't know. I mean, what I thought was quite revealing is that she clearly doesn't want a general election. She said that at the end. Yeah. And I think there is a yearning for change in the country. We've had the Conservatives in now for 12 years, and look what it's given us. It's given us people's mortgages going up by hundreds of pounds. It's given us pensioners shivering in the cold because the pension was cut. Families who rely on universal credit, that's one of the most important social security payments, that's seen cuts as well, and people can't feed their children. I think people want an election to get rid of this Tory government.
You mentioned the market chaos unleashed by Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng in the mini-budget's unfunded tax cuts. But Labour supports the cuts to income tax, basic rate, national insurance and stamp duty, and the freezing of energy bills. So what would Labour do differently?
Well, I mean, what happened with that mini-budget, it wasn't just the billions of pounds worth of unfunded tax cuts, which disproportionately benefit the wealthiest. It was refusing to have any validation of the plans from the independent OBR, which in turn meant there were question marks about whether Britain could afford to pay her debts. That led to turmoil on the markets. It led to this huge spike in what's called gilt yields, which in turn led to a run on pension funds, which in turn led to mortgage rates soaring. So this has been calamitous, and it is a direct consequence of those decisions. Look, what would we do? We would have a fair approach to taxation. We don't need the non-dom tax relief that we've got in this country. We would get rid of that. We don't need to be going ahead with these big tax breaks for corporations. So there are things that we would do differently, and by doing things differently, we would fund more breakfast clubs. So parents who want to help feed their children, but also want help with childcare, would have extra breakfast clubs, would recruit more staff for our National Health Service because it's on its knees. So there are things that we would definitely do differently. We'd set up something called GB Energy, because why is it if you've got a wind farm in a part of the country, those wind farms are often owned and invested in by other countries? Why aren't we invested in wind farms? Why aren't we invested in solar in this country? Not only is it good for jobs, but it's also good for the climate, and it's also, as we now know, good for national security as well. So there are things that we would do significantly differently.
The Conservatives are funding their tax cuts by borrowing. The things you've mentioned there, you've mentioned non-dom tax relief and you've mentioned corporation tax. Do the sums add up? Would you be able to get enough money out of those things?
The sums definitely add up. And what you'll see when we go to a general election, our manifesto, every single commitment in that manifesto, we will itemise and explain how we're going to fund it. So we're going to get rid of the non-dom tax relief. That's going to help us fund breakfast clubs. It's going to help us fund more doctors, more nurses for our National Health Service. But we are going to borrow to invest, and that's how we're going to invest. That's what we're going to do, to invest in green energy of the future, because that will create jobs, it will create prosperity, it will also bring bills down, and it's also good for climate as well. So you can make different choices. Government is about choices. This government has chosen to introduce big tax cuts for the very wealthy when we've got people queuing up at food banks. I don't think that's right.
Do you agree that benefits should rise in line with inflation?
Absolutely. Not only do I think that, Conservative ministers used to think that, including a Conservative cabinet that included Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the then Work and Pensions Secretary, who's now the Deputy Prime Minister. They all thought this only a few months ago. The idea that they will now cut universal credit, disability benefits, pension credit for poorer pensioners, I think is quite obscene. And actually, I've been talking to Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. People want to block these cuts, so let's see where we actually get to. But I think if we work together on a cross-party basis, we can block Liz Truss's cuts, which are going to hit working people, vulnerable people, disabled people, and poorer pensioners.
Should public sector pay also rise in line with inflation?
Well, what we've said on public sector pay is that obviously we want fair pay settlements, because one of the problems in the public sector is that we don't have enough staff, and that is to do with pay and conditions in the public sector. Like, we're short of 100,000 staff in the NHS, partly why the NHS is on its knees. We need 40,000 extra nurses, for example. But we need fair pay settlements, and they should be agreed, they should be negotiated through the pay bargaining processes. That's what we've said. But we definitely want fair pay settlements across the public sector. The
pay bodies have, on average, recommended a 5% pay rise for public sector workers. Obviously, with inflation at 12%, depending on whether you take CPI or RPI, that's a real terms pay cut. So does the Labour Party support a real terms pay cut for public sector workers? We've always said that these pay rounds should be fair and they should be negotiated. And I think one of the worries is that we're going to see, particularly in the NHS, like we've seen on the railways, Tory ministers deliberately stoking unrest. And I actually think the Deputy Prime Minister, who's now the Health Secretary, should be working with the trade unions across the whole of the NHS, working with what we call the providers of NHS services. They're the institutions, they're hospitals and so on, like NHS providers, and all the other stakeholders in the NHS. That Deputy Prime Minister should be working with all of those to agree a fair pay settlement. I won't list all of the trade unions here now. There are many of them. From what you're saying there, is it the Labour Party's position then that it supports the demands of the likes of the RMT, the UCU, and the other unions that are in trade dispute right now?
No, we've always said that workers have the right to withdraw their labour. Of course they do. And the idea that Tory ministers should be taking away that fundamental right is unacceptable. But the reason why these workers, whether it's on the railways or potentially in the NHS, are withdrawing their labour is because they don't believe that there is a fair and meaningful negotiation going on to come to a fair pay settlement. And actually, Tory ministers can avoid all these strikes, they could avoid all this industrial action if they engaged in serious, grown-up, meaningful negotiations. We didn't have NHS strikes, didn't have nurses going on strikes for 13 years of a Labour government. That's because we put in place something called Agenda for Change, which we agreed with the NHS unions, which was a fairer pay settlement across the NHS. But we got there through proper, serious negotiation and discussion. Instead, we have ministers stoking industrial unrest, and that is the last thing we want. Especially, we won't want it anywhere, but we especially don't want it across the health service.
If the government is to follow through with that 5% average pay rise and not make any change to the budgets, their options are cuts to headcount, cuts to services, or more borrowing.
Well, yeah, but remember, you've actually now got in the NHS, and you've got it in the public sector, different bits of the public sector, including job centres. People who work for the government, say in a job centre, their pay is so low, they're now so poorly paid that they're applying for universal credit to top up their income. So the government might argue it's unaffordable, but then on the other hand, all they're doing is spending more money by topping up the poor wages with a bigger universal credit, a bigger number of people on universal credit. So governments have got to look at should be looking at all of this in the round, but should be sitting down through the proper architecture to negotiate fair settlements with the staff representatives, their trade unions.
One potential measure that the IFS has recommended is that you could look at decreasing employee pension contributions to put more money directly into the pay packet of workers at a time when they need it. What do you think of that idea?
Well, I don't think public sector workers pay into their public sector pensions, and I don't think we should be messing around with people's public sector pensions. We have a fair settlement. Actually, I remember the last Labour government worked quite closely with the trade unions and did put in place reforms to public sector pensions, and it was accepted it was a fair set of reforms. It wasn't all, there were bumpy negotiations, but that's because ministers were prepared to sit down and have those negotiations with the workplace reps, the trade unions. So look, I don't think we should be changing the way in which our public sector pensions operate.
There are myriad problems in Britain right now, and we opened this interview by talking about the prospect of a general election. Let's say Labour wins that election. You're Secretary of State, DWP. First day in the job, what's on your agenda?
We've got to fundamentally reform and overhaul our universal credit system. I mean, not only has it been cut, people lost £20 a week, then there were a set of real terms cut, the value of it, because of inflation. Now there's this potential further real terms cut because of inflation again, and people are in absolute poverty and destitution. There's 500,000 children in this country who are destitute. The definition of destitution is that they can't heat their homes, or they're in cold homes, they're hungry, they can't afford basic toiletries to keep themselves clean, or they don't even have a bed to sleep in, probably sleeping on the kitchen floor or a bathroom floor or in a bath or on a living room floor. 500,000 children destitute, 4 million children in poverty. A food bank in my constituency, it opens its doors at 12 o'clock on a Friday. People will be queuing in all weather from about 9:30, 10 o'clock, all the way up the street for that food bank. And there are women who have gone to that food bank who have been offered fresh food, and have to turn down fresh food because the woman said, I can't afford to keep my fridge switched on. So they cannot afford the electricity bills associated with running a fridge to keep food fresh. We've got stories of children turning up at school with tummy bugs because the food has not been kept fresh in the fridge because families can't afford to keep their fridges on. We've got pensioners, as long as we're a pensioner who's undergoing rounds of chemotherapy but cannot heat her home because of energy bills. So we've got to change our universal credit system, and we've got to give people their dignity back. So that would be one of my big priorities. We've also got to get better at really supporting people into work, giving people proper support through the job centre, not threatening them and cutting their benefits and sanctioning them, but giving people real support with training and advice to find well-paying good jobs. So we've got a big agenda for the Department of Work and Pensions, and of course pensions and pensioners is a big part of our remit as well. And actually the pension has been cut by the biggest amount for 50 years under the Tories. Now pensioner poverty is beginning to rise again in this country. So big agenda for Department of Work and Pensioners, but tackling this destitution and poverty is what motivates me.
You've mentioned as well getting the over 50s back into work, because there's, I think, 1 million vacancies right now in our workforce.
Yeah, so for example, there's something like 600,000 over 50s have left the labour market since the pandemic, and those forced out of work for reasons of sickness is now at its highest rate for 20 years. Now, a big burden of that is mental health, because people cannot get access to mental health services, which is why one of the things when I used to do health for the Labour Party, one of our big priorities that we made a big priority was access to mental health services, something I care hugely about, because people just cannot get access to whether it's therapies or if it's more that they need more medical intervention, whether people just cannot get it. So we've got to reform mental health services to give people proper support. But a lot of people are also leaving the labour market because they're stuck on a waiting list. They might need a hip replacement and might have a hernia, or they might have an ongoing chronic condition and they just cannot get the ongoing medical care and help that they need from the NHS. So on saying all of that though, there are people who say they want to go back to work if they can find the right type of job that is suitable for them, which is flexible for them, and yet there's nothing in the system to help people find that job. So I want to reform the way in which we do employment support in this country to really give people the support and help that they need to find the sort of job, if it's suitable for them, but only if it's suitable for them. The Tory approach of threatening people and saying if you don't go and do that job, all your benefits is going to be cut. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. We need to give people proper support and tailored help, and that's what we want to do.
Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks a lot.
We appreciate it.